The stages of listening to Boise State Public Radio podcasts. Step 1, testing the waters. You tune into an episode or two. Nothing too serious. Step 2, you got a little hooked on one of those series like Extremely American or Scandalized, and now you're binging. No judgment, but you did listen to it in one day. Step 3, now you're subscribed to a feed. You get notifications to your phone every time there's a new daily episode of The Connector or Idaho Matters. I see where this is going. Step 4, you realize how much time you're spending with Boise State Public Radio podcasts and the fact that it doesn't cost you a dime. Step 5, you decide to step up and support your podcast listening because you can, because you want to, not because you have to. All right, now's the time, you podcast fan you. Go to boisestatepublicradio.org and click donate to support your love of Boise State Public Radio podcast listening today.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. As we bring 2024 to a close, we wanted to take a look back at the last year through the lens of public health. From a COVID surge to the bubonic plague, there was measles, bird flu, whooping cough, tuberculosis, polio. It has been a busy year in the public health arena, and Dr. David Pate has been our guide every Wednesday throughout this year and frankly, the past 4 years, keeping us up to date on all the things that might impact our health. He is the former CEO of St. Luke's Health System, and he is the co-author of the book, Preparing for the Next Global Outbreak. And he is here with us today to take a look back at 2024. Hi, Dr. Pate.
Hi, Gemma.
All right, Dr. Pate, here we go again. I cannot believe it, but another year. So if we can, right? Okay, so let's go all the way back to January, when the city of Boise reported rising levels of COVID-19 in the wastewater system. In fact, more than 1,400 people were dying of COVID in the U.S. every week when we went into 2024. So we don't always talk about this very often, but COVID is still here.
Well, it is. And in fact, we are having another big uptick in COVID right now. And I think people just aren't paying very much attention to it in general. But it's still here. The virus is still mutating, and we're seeing new variants. And so it is important that, especially for those who are concerned about the long-term complications or those who are at high risk for severe disease, that they continue to monitor this and take the appropriate precautions for themselves.
And get the vaccine if that is something that you have done or have been doing or have contemplated doing.
Or even if you stop, because we're finding that, in fact, there are a number of benefits to staying up with the vaccines in terms of the protections that you get. It's not foolproof, but it is helping people.
So let's go to February of 2024. There was a report of someone in Oregon who had come down with the bubonic plague. Okay, Dr. Pate, this was something that killed millions of people in the Middle Ages. So how did we see this in 2024? And I guess where are we now with this?
Yeah, so bubonic plague is oldie but goodie, like you said. It's actually caused by a bacteria. And what happens is that fleas from rodents they get the bacteria from the rodents, and then those
Mm.
fleas can transmit it to us. Now, bubonic plague, fortunately, is not very common. In the United States, some years we see no cases, some years we see up to about 17 cases, but on average, we see about 7 cases a year. So that's not a lot. The reason that we talked about it and why people in this part of the country hear about it is because this is where we see it when it does occur. It tends to be in the western United States. And what actually, the last big epidemic of bubonic plague for the United States was 1924 to 1925 in Los Angeles. And
Huh.
as they grappled with it and they drove out the rats, got the rat control and mice control in LA, what happened is it moved to rural areas. And so now, mostly where we see cases of bubonic plague are in rural areas when they come into contact where there are areas with mice or rats and those kinds of
Mm.
things. And that's where we see it. So it's important to be careful about dead animals. We'll talk about that more about another disease, but with bubonic plague, the reason it's called that is when you get infected, you get fever and very swollen and painful lymph nodes, and those are called buboes, giving it the name bubonic
Mm.
plague. But we can treat it as long as we recognize it early and somebody gets to the hospital early. We've got a very good treatment for it.
So I want to talk now about something that happened in March, but this is a different kind of health problem. This was a cyber attack, and it paralyzed the largest U.S. healthcare payment system, and it impacted Idahoans right here at home. So, Dr. Pate, first off, quickly kind of give us an update on what this cyber attack was for folks who need a refresher, but also I'm curious about how concerning this was when we saw how quick and how widespread this happened, and frankly, the fallout and how many problems it caused.
Cyber attacks on healthcare facilities have been a problem for some time. It was one of my number one issues that I went to bed worrying about and woke up worrying about. And of course, we took many, many steps to try to protect our organization. But in this case, and why it was so widespread was that it actually wasn't any particular healthcare organization, hospital or clinic or something. It was a company that was widely used by healthcare organizations
Mm.
to perform certain aspects of very complicated billing, and their system got hacked, and then that caused a problem where a lot of healthcare organizations basically they didn't get infected with the virus, but they had to shut their systems down to prevent it from getting infected. So whether it was from direct involvement of the this large company's health system, their information system, or whether it was just people having to stop using the services to prevent getting infected, it had a huge ripple effect. And we need to think about that for going forward, that we may not want to have so many people dependent on the same system. It certainly
Mm.
increases the risk unless that organization is going to take extraordinary measures. But basically, if people are intent on hacking a system, they can generally find a way to do it.
Yeah, it was pretty scary though, Dr. Babe, because I remember folks were having issues like picking up prescriptions, things like that, because of this cyber attack and how it impacted so many healthcare systems.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So also in March, Dr. Pate, let's talk about a disease that actually had been eliminated here in the United States, I believe back in about the year 2000. But then we started seeing it pop up all around the country. And this is the measles. Oh, it is back. It is spreading around the globe. Talk about how this happened in March and frankly where we are with this now.
Well, this is a very concerning development because, first of all the childhood vaccine preventable infections.
Mm-hmm.
This one has been one of the most successful because getting vaccinated against the measles is somewhere between around 94 to 96% protective for life. So people are complaining about the COVID vaccine because we have to keep getting boosters. There's one that you just go through your series, and then basically you're going to get protected for life. And yet, this virus is one of the most contagious of all. So you can even enter a room an hour after somebody with measles was in that room and end up getting infected. And if you're in a room with somebody with measles and you're not vaccinated or have never had measles, you have a very high chance of you're going to get infected. This is really, in my mind, the canary in the coal mine for us, because in order to prevent outbreaks, we have to get the general public, we have to get levels of vaccination in the low 90s in order to thwart these outbreaks. And so when we're seeing outbreaks, it's because vaccination levels have declined. And measles is not a innocuous infection. It can certainly send kids to the hospital, as we've seen with all the recent outbreaks. In some children, it can cause a life-threatening complications involving the brain or the lungs, and some of those children will end up dying. So, and it's a shame because the vaccine is very safe. We've been using it for decades, and it's extremely effective.
All right, Dr. Pate, we are caught up to April of 24. Now, this is when the U.S. Department of Agriculture confirmed bird flu here in Idaho. And this was when cows at Acacia County Dairy Farm started showing symptoms, and then a person in Texas actually came down with the disease. It was also in April when the World Health Organization reported an upswing in diphtheria. So we're going to talk more about the bird flu towards the end of the program, Dr. Pate, because we have a lot of actually developing information coming out today about that. So what I do want to talk about right now is diphtheria, because you said this was because not enough people are getting vaccinated for diphtheria. So again, similar to what we just talked about with the measles.
That's right. And diphtheria is a disease that, like measles, we brought under control here in the United States. We rarely see it. It's caused also by a bacteria, in fact, the toxin from a bacteria. And it's dreadful to see a child that is seriously ill with diphtheria. Diphtheria is that toxin can produce a membrane that covers the back of the throat, and it's very tough and hard. It's grayish. It's not something you can just knock out of the way with a swab. And literally, the children can have their airways obstructed and not be able to breathe. And it's just absolutely dreadful. And we shouldn't want this disease to reemerge. And yet we've seen cases of it here in the United States. I know there were cases reported in Australia, places where we've been vaccinating for this. So this is a problem of not keeping up with the vaccines. The vaccination for diphtheria is along with the tetanus vaccine in many cases, and the pertussis or whooping cough. And of course, you remember we've also been having outbreaks of whooping cough. And so these are all vaccine preventable. It's a dreadful disease, and children can get very, very sick. Prior to the vaccines, we would see 5 to 10% of people infected with this die. If you were less than 5 or over age 40, we could see up to 20% die. That's senseless. We need to get our vaccine rates up and prevent this disease. It's very safe, actually.
So, Dr. Pate, you mentioned whooping cough. So let's go to May, because in May was when we started to watch a whooping cough outbreak start in North Idaho. Now, at that point in May, bird flu had spread to 9 states. And also in May, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. reported that he had a dead brain worm in his head. And NPR reported that more than a billion, with a B, people probably have brain worms. Really?
Yes. But most of those people are in underdeveloped countries. They're not here in the United States. We don't know exactly how many people in the United States have this condition, but it's estimated that maybe 2 to 6 people out of a million have that in the United States. And the reason we don't have it is we tend to cook and prepare our meat
Mm.
in a healthy way here in the United States, and we have the FDA inspecting our meat production. But this brain worm that he has, and I don't know specifically which one he has. The most common one would be the pork tapeworm, and that is from swallowing it. You swallow the eggs of the worm either in the meat itself because it had it and it was undercooked, or you're with somebody that has it because they will shed that in their stool, and then if you're not careful about your hand hygiene, you can get it from their feces into your mouth and you can get infected that way. And in cases where there's a prolonged or significant exposure to this tapeworm, it can get into your brain. And that apparently has happened with RFK Jr. And of course, this is not altogether surprising. He's publicly indicated that he drinks raw milk. And of course, we've talked before about all the potential hazards of drinking raw milk. There's also hazards with eating undercooked meat.
Okay. So, Dr. Pate, let's get to June. And this was when 20 dairy farms in Idaho had reports of bird flu. Now, the CDC issued a health advisory. I'm hoping I'm saying this right. Dengue fever in America. And
Exactly.
so we heard of a new deadlier strain of Mpox in June as well. This was in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So let's first start with dengue fever. How common is this, and is this a concern?
Worldwide, it's extremely common. Dengue fever is a virus transmitted by mosquitoes called the Aedes mosquito. And we do have that mosquito here in the United States, but it tends to occur in the southern hemisphere, Central and South America, Africa, India, Asia, the Pacific Islands. Now, dengue has been a problem in a number of our U.S. territories for some time. And in fact, Puerto Rico declared a public health emergency back earlier this year because they had cases soaring. But we've seen a global increase in dengue across the globe this year. And what we're starting to see and have seen for the last couple of years is some local transmission in some of the more southern United States. That is thought to be potentially in part travelers that come from those countries where they are having dengue come up here, and or that the global warming and the fact that we have warmer temperatures in the southern part of the United States has made it more able for this virus to thrive and be transmitted by the mosquitoes here. But we have had local cases reported in Texas, Florida, California, and most recently, even Arizona, I believe. So we are concerned that we might be seeing more in the future, but we're watching.
Okay. So, Dr. Pate, in July, the level of COVID rose in Boise, and we were starting to get fairly concerned about bird flu moving from dairy cows to beef cattle. In fact, by August, a new dominant strain of COVID hit California pretty hard, and it was spreading all around the country. Also in July, Africa declared a public health emergency because of a new strain of Mpox, which had actually been detected also in Sweden and Thailand. So, Dr. Payne, I think this might be a good time to talk about how these diseases mutate and become more deadly, because this is, I know, when we go back 4+ years ago, and we first started talking about COVID with you, you talked about, hey, if this mutates, we don't know what could happen. And I don't think it's something that a lot of folks actually had ever given much thought to if they weren't in the medical or science field.
Well, exactly. And so I think what's helpful for people to understand is that mutations of viruses occur when the virus is trying to make baby viruses. And what happens is it can happen a number of ways. One can be just an error that gets made when the genetic material is being copied to make that new virus. But other ways, and different viruses do different things. We've talked about with the SARS-CoV-2 virus that it can recombine, and we get recombinants, and that those are the variants that start with the letter X, which we are dealing with right now. But for example, if you have a chronically ill person or a immunocompromised person and they have two different variants, which is certainly possible, they can recombine into a brand new one. And we think that's where Omicron came from, is through that process. But also certain viruses like the influenza virus can actually just swap whole parts of genetic material in a process called reassortment, which is what we're worried about with the bird flu. And could it reassort with a human flu and then become a really big problem? But for all of these events, the more it replicates, the more people it infects, and the more animal species it infects, the more likely we are going to see a problem.
And Dr. Pate, is this what happened with this new strain of Mpox that I mentioned, where we saw this in when Africa declared a public health emergency this summer?
Yes, and what we do with the Mpox virus is we talk about, we don't call them strains, we call them clades, and this is an evolution of this virus that it actually made it a more virulent strain, which means it can kill more people or cause more harm. And it changed its behavior. The Mpox we saw in 2022 was mostly transmitted through sex, and particularly among men who have sex with men. This new one, it's really disproportionately affecting children. It does not require, it can be sexually transmitted, but it just requires close contact. And so that's what can happen when a virus changes significantly, and this one has.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go into September now, Dr. Pate. This is when Gaza reported its first case of polio in 25 years in a 10-month-old baby. And the World Health Organization was working to vaccinate Palestinians for this disease. Dr. Pate, you wrote up a blog post about polio. And can you talk a little bit about this disease? But also about how if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. becomes a member of soon-to-be President Donald Trump's cabinet, he wants to put certain vaccines on hold because he doesn't believe that vaccines are safe, in particular the polio vaccine, Dr. Pate. And frankly, I'm just shaking my head at this.
Well, I'm glad you are. This was not on my bingo card. But what has happened is, of course, RFK Jr. is going through the vetting process for nomination. And so people are digging up things. And one of the things that they have surfaced lately and prompted my blog post was that a lawyer that works very closely with RFK Jr. had petitioned the FDA to either withdraw the approval for the polio vaccine or to suspend it until we could do randomized controlled trials and reevaluate the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine. That is absolutely inane because this vaccine, the IPV is what we call it, that started being in use in 1955. So
Mhm.
we have 69 years of experience with this vaccine. I guarantee you we have seen all the safety things we're going to see. And in fact, we really haven't seen anything of note with it. The other thing is that it's ironic that he's demanding, and this is a common complaint you will hear, is a lot of anti-vaxxers say, oh, well, there was no randomized controlled trial. Of course, when they were promoting ivermectin, there weren't randomized controls trials for that. But polio, this vaccine had the largest randomized clinical trial in history when it was approved. And it's very dangerous. And so we just need to be reminded polio is a terrible disease. It was disabling more than 20,000 people a year. We had hospitals with iron lungs to support people. Senator Mitch McConnell had polio and it paralyzed one of his legs when he was a child. Thank God he's recovered, but there are many who didn't. And it would be a terrible thing for us to put polio vaccines on hold. And RFK Jr. himself has alleged that the polio vaccine killed more people than the polio did itself. And that is absolutely unsupportable. It is crazy.
So, Dr. Pate, can we talk more for a minute about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his nomination for this position in Trump's cabinet? Because I think you can hold two things at one time. And I will say this. I think what he brings up about food in our country and processing food, right? And how highly processed our food is and how that is damaging to so many people. And then, on the other hand, his ideas around vaccines. Do you think because he makes sense when it does come to really needing to look at how we process our food, the companies behind this, right? Our obesity rates, looking at all of that versus the fact that when it comes to vaccines, if he chooses not to be vaccinated, fine. But to say that other people cannot have access to these vaccines, I just don't understand that.
Well, you're right, and you're exactly right that two things can be true at the same time. He does raise important points. There is a problem with chronic disease in the United States. There are issues about our environment and our food that do need more investigation. My problem is that he's not the right one to head this because head of the Department of Health and Human Services is also over the NIH, the most well-respected and regarded and largest scientific investigation agency there is. And so if RFK Jr. wanted to do these things, but would respect the science, and those of us in science, we go with whatever the science tells us. We don't shape the science to form our opinions. And if he would respect the science, then that would be great. Problem is, he is touting many things that science has already shown are not true. And even in the food area, while he's very right, we should look at food, he also is a proponent of drinking raw milk. There is no support for health benefits of that. In fact, it's dangerous. So I'm afraid that even though he's bringing up good points, in my book, he is not the right person to lead the organization.
And is that part of the problem right there, Dr. Pate, is because he does bring up certain points that sometimes other things can then be overlooked or glossed over, in particular, the science behind certain things.
Yeah, we don't want someone to have a bias towards everything has to be in this direction. And if the science is telling us something different, then I'm just not going to accept the science. That's not how it works. And we need someone that will respect the science. Now, if the science were to show us that, oh yeah, drinking raw milk is great for you, then yeah, then we should do that. If the science were to tell us that, yeah, vaccines cause autism, then yeah, we should rethink
Mhm.
vaccines. But that's not what the science tells us. And we need people who can respect the science and know how to interpret the science. That is not, neither of those are his strengths.
Let's get up to the fall in October. Dr. Pate, this is when we unfortunately set a new record when the CDC reported that 200 children had died of influenza during the flu season. And Dr. Pate, COVID also got a lot of attention, but the flu, can we talk about this? It has been, as we know, around much longer. And to see these numbers of children who have died from flu, the last flu season, how concerned are you about this?
Well, it's always a concern because people downplay the flu. And I think a lot of that is because it's common for people to have colds and say, oh, it was the flu. So they think of it as a mild illness. In true influenza, if you've ever had it, and I
It's
remember
horrible.
my, oh my gosh, and it hits you like a ton of bricks. Most people can tell me the minute that they realize they were infected, and you have aching over every part of your body. Sometimes they'll describe it hurts to have even people touch you. They have sometimes have pain with just moving their eyes. They have high fever. So it's very different. But what people don't realize is that for a long time, we have realized that the rate of heart attacks and strokes goes up in the immediate short term after having influenza. So for older people, we do sometimes see them have heart attacks or strokes later, even when they seem to be recovering from the influenza. We see a condition where that looks like they're getting over the influenza, but then they get a secondary bacterial infection. And in fact, I remember decades ago, one of my wife's classmates died from that, and it can be quite serious. So, yes, we tend to understate influenza. Yes, a lot of people get flu and do recover from it. But I think this downplaying of it has resulted in fewer people getting the flu shots. And the way that flu spreads in our communities is it starts in our schools, and our little precious school children bring it home and infect families.
Mhm. I have to say, Dr. Pate, I was always pretty nonchalant as a young adult about the flu shot, never got it. And then I got the flu. And I had just moved here. I didn't know a soul. And I literally had to get myself to urgent care and then get myself to the pharmacy to get Tamiflu. And I vividly remember standing in line at the grocery store trying to, waiting to pay for this Tamiflu. And the checker, the cashier, looked at the people in front of me and said, "You need to let her through. She's about to pass out." I mean, that
Oh, yeah.
changed my perspective on getting the flu shot. I don't think I've ever been so sick in my life as I was with the flu. And I was healthy. I was in my late 20s.
Oh yeah, and many people have that experience. And the thing about it is, even if you believe you're going to survive, generally people when they get influenza, it's like several days that you couldn't work if you wanted to. Like your description of what you were like in the pharmacy. You
Mhm.
can hardly get out of bed. You just feel miserable. And so for me, I always got the flu shot every year because I couldn't afford a week off from work.
Right. Exactly. All right. Let's talk about what happened in November because Mpox continued to spread here in the United States. A new human case of bird flu was making the news. And then there were contaminated carrots, which were making people sick in 18 states. We've heard about a lot of food recalls this year, Dr. Pate. We had all of that deli meat recalled all across the country. We've seen, I'm trying to remember what other outbreaks we've had with like Salmonella, E. coli. I mean, it. Are we seeing more recalls, or are we just talking about it more?
I think the latter. We have had some big outbreaks this year, but food outbreaks, frankly, are a rather common and typical issue for public health departments to deal with every year. I do think some of these were big outbreaks, so they got a lot of attention. And I also think there is more attention being paid to public health issues. Overall, our food is very safe. However, it still requires things that we've already talked about. For example, you have to cook things properly. One of the other food outbreaks you were trying to think of, I think, was the outbreak of the E. coli associated with what we believe was onions with the McDonald's
Yes.
quarter pounder. Yeah. And so, yeah, you one is you have to cook food properly. And we talked about RFK Jr.'s brainworm. Another is you have to wash vegetables. You have to be very careful about that. And then listeria is a common recurrent problem because that is associated with cold products. And when it gets into a factory or their equipment, it is very hard to get rid of that. And I remember decades ago, my favorite ice cream in the world is Bluebell, which you can't get up here. It's made in Texas. And they had a huge outbreak. And I think they were shut down for years, I think, trying to recover from that. So they happen, but generally our food's safe, but you do have to exercise care. And these do happen from time to time.
So, Dr. Pate, I also want to talk about, I believe this was late October, maybe early November, when we started hearing about some whooping cough outbreaks. I briefly mentioned that in the spring, there was a whooping cough outbreak in North Idaho. And then all of a sudden, we started seeing whooping cough here in the Treasure Valley. In fact, I got a little hot under the collar personally about it as a mom because it was in both of my children's schools, and both of my children had close contact with students that had whooping cough. And I want to talk about this a little bit and get your thoughts on this because, again, whooping cough or pertussis, there's a vaccine for it. We get our babies vaccinated for it, those of us who choose to vaccinate our children. It is frustrating when you see a disease as a parent like this get into schools, but also what was surprising to me was it almost seemed a lackadaisical attitude, not necessarily from the schools, but I would say anecdotally, maybe from other parents who just was like, oh yeah, okay, it's whooping cough. As my children tell me, I overreact too much about their safety. So I'm asking you, are we overreacting about our children's safety?
No, you're a great mom, Gemma. But here's the deal with whooping cough. It typically doesn't make older children as sick. The people that get the most sick from whooping cough and where it's actually a threat to their lives potentially, it's babies. And so the danger of taking a cavalier approach to this in schools is that those kids, while someone the age of your kids, they could certainly get sick, but they're not likely to have a life-threatening illness. But they might have a young child at home, and that is the big risk with whooping cough. And again, we talked about diphtheria earlier. Pertussis or whooping cough is in the same vaccine with diphtheria. So you've heard, just as we review this year, a common refrain: measles, diphtheria, whooping cough or pertussis. All of these are in our common routine vaccines. Unlike measles, that does typically last you for a lifetime, you do have to get periodic boosters for diphtheria and pertussis because that immunity does wane, but it will last you a good 10 years. But we've got to keep up with these things so that we can protect our school environments and especially those that those school kids might go home to.
Well, and I think in particular, Dr. Pate, that's such a good point, right? Because in our case, I think part of why I was a little hot under the collar is that we have very dear neighbors who had a baby at the end of September. And, so sending a note to them saying, we are not going to see you. We are not, don't even stop by the driveway if the kids are outside, right? Because they had a newborn baby. Yeah.
Yes. And in those children, it can land them in the ICU. And in some cases, it can even kill them.
So let's get to this month, to December. And we had word of 2 new disease outbreaks. And we talked about this very recently, Dr. Pate, Disease X and the bleeding eye virus. And we had word that a student at Meridian High School had tuberculosis. So, Dr. Pate, again, how concerned should people be when we hear about something like TB in a school?
So it's concerning because tuberculosis is a contagious infection. Not everybody with tuberculosis is infectious, but we don't know very many of the details of the status of this person. We don't actually know whether it was a student or faculty or staff. But it certainly can be contagious. It's not nearly as contagious as COVID or measles or some of the other things we've talked about. But one of the problems can be knowing whether you've gotten infected with it. And so we do have to screen people for that. TB is a worldwide problem, and it is on the uptick. In the United States, we have had a concentrated effort to really bring it under control. We're not there yet, but we have really reduced the frequency of tuberculosis in the United States. Now it is most particularly a problem in our prison populations, in homeless shelters, among the homeless, et cetera. But every now and then there are these kind of cases, and it is a threat, and that's why we always get public health involved to determine what group of people may have been exposed to it.
So I want to take our last 5 minutes and talk about where we are with bird flu right now, Dr. Pate, because as of today, bird flu is killing thousands of birds all over Idaho. We're talking from Lake Lowell to Parma to Fort Boise. And in fact, Idaho Fish and Game says this is happening all over the country. So I have a couple of questions for you. What should we do if we see dead birds? Can we touch them safely? What do we do?
No, the Fish and Game for Idaho issued a very good report. They're estimating hundreds of thousands of infected birds. That is not surprising to me, but concerning. So no, do not touch a dead bird or even a bird that seems to be acting strange, maybe not flying away from you, that could be ill, and make sure that your kids don't. The other thing is if you let your pets outside off leash, if it's just going to be in your yard, I would check your yard first, make sure you don't have dead birds, particularly cats. Cats get severely ill from this infection. It is highly lethal in them, and they develop a terrible neurologic illness from it. Dogs less so, but we now know that dogs can be infected by it. So I would not want to let my pet be exposed to a dead bird, and they'll be tempted to, or a diseased one where they might attack it. But also your kids. If there is a dead bird on your property or you're trying to dispose of it, we're not sure exactly how it's being transmitted. We certainly have ideas, but I would wear a high quality mask, and I would wear gloves. And then what I would do is take the garbage bag, use it as your bag to grab the dead bird, put it in your trash, seal it up. Don't let anybody in that. We have to take caution for right now.
So, Dr. Pate, I'm thinking about all of the geese that are in Boise. They are in my neighborhood all the time. We have a cat. We let him outside. Should folks like me, because I know I'm not the only one, should we not be allowing our cats outside right now?
Boy, that's a tough one. I think that where Fish and Game is saying that they've identified these birds, they tend to be concentrated into certain areas where we see lots of the geese and all. So I think probably not. But again, I would inspect your own property just in case they are dying with a flyover, or they've landed because they're sick and then have died on your property. I'd check your property before letting your animals out. I don't think you need to be overly concerned about just like taking them on walks on a leash, but don't let them sniff around or probe a diseased bird or a dead bird. And we know with some other illnesses that if you're, those geese poop everywhere. We do know that you can aerosolize some viruses when we've studied other diseases before. So I would try to avoid stepping on their poop, which probably most people do anyway. But in areas where there's a lot, I just kind of stay a little bit away from that. But we just don't know enough yet, and we don't know how widespread it is, but we know there's a lot of birds infected right now.
I have a minute left with you, and just this morning, the CDC confirmed the first case of severe bird flu in a person in the United States. They've been hospitalized in Louisiana. So I know with just 1 minute left, Dr. Pate, I am assuming we're going to be talking about this come January. And how concerned are you about this case?
This is concerning because the cases that have been transmitted by cows has seemed to be milder and mostly affecting causing conjunctivitis. But we now have a teenager who was deathly ill in Canada that is probably exposed by bird, and then this gentleman from bird. I think we're seeing something changing in this virus. That's what makes us worried. And of course, now we're starting in our human flu season. So that even increases the risk for reasons we can talk about on a later show.
All right. Well, with that said, as always, Dr. Pate, we so appreciate you. We've been talking with Dr. David Pate. He is the former CEO of St. Luke's Health System and the co-author of the book, Preparing for the Next Global Outbreak. And we will, of course, be talking with Dr. Pate come January about more public health issues. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.
If you like podcasts like this, explore more from the Boise State Public Radio podcast family. There you'll find a mix of daily news, Idaho Voices, and in-depth series on a wide range of topics. I'm talking wild horses, political scandals, sustainable ranching, and militia groups in a post-January 6th world. Wherever you get your podcasts, just search Boise State Public Radio to find what Idaho's NPR station has in store for you.